Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to the Institute for Personal Development, Kriya Yoga Ashram, where total consciousness is the new frontier.
Kriya Yoga is union of the individual with the divine. Join us as we explore the practices to initiate this process.
Good morning. Welcome to the Voice of Yoga. Let's talk consciousness. I am your hostess, Lisa Winton, and with me is Kenny Toy, also known as Swami Jayananda, founder of the Institute for Personal Development, located here in Hampton, New Hampshire. Good morning, Swami. Thank you for being here today. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing pretty good today. How about you?
I'm doing great today, too. Thanks for asking. And we want to thank you all for tuning in. Today in the Voice of Yoga, we will talk about why most spiritual practices are not delivering the fruits of divine perfection. Listen as we expand on the idea of like attracts like, and two things can't occupy the same space at the same time, as the equivalent to Mary Baker Eddy's statement, to think with God as God. In this show, we will explain the value of declaring yourself to be immortal and understand yourself to be so. Welcome to the Voice of Yoga. We are talking consciousness. Join the Kriya Yoga Spiritual Advance to get the light in your soul and accept spiritual individuality. Swami, the title of today's show is Accepting Individual Spiritual Inheritance. Those are four great words that we can break down. Why would you pick that title for today?
Well, what we're really trying to do here is understand the difference between just living as a good human being and understanding yourself to be the divine image and likeness, which is what we would refer to as the inheritance. It's one thing to talk about these things, but it's also an important thing to be able to experience it. The pure idea of the divine mind is looking for its counterpart. And when human thought is purified of mortal sense, it becomes a hospitable environment to invite divine truth into consciousness. Consciousness is experience. So we can use experience to determine what we are conscious of. Keeping in mind, truth and consciousness must bring divine qualities.
Well, let's talk about the word accepting. What does that look like when we do that?
Yeah, to accept spiritual identity. It's an interesting dynamic here that we're talking about. We don't make ourselves spiritual. We are already spiritual, but we're not conscious of this dynamic. We're not conscious of the truth of our being, that we are the image and likeness of an indestructible principle. And so the language we use, we simply accept that. But it's way more complicated than it sounds, especially with our understanding of, well, just accept your divine inheritance. We hear this a lot now. We are all the image and likeness of the divine, perfect as your Father. All the Father has is thine. Ask in my name, and it shall be given. We say truth dispels error as light dispels darkness. So where's the proof? What to do when the outer world of experience is not bringing forth the divine qualities? What I've learned is, just as a pilot has a checklist before he starts up the airplane, the mystic must examine and check for levels of consciousness and degrees of awareness. Even though we have parables like the prodigal son, we may find turning back to the Father's house may not be as easy as simply getting a bus ticket. And so this is what metaphysical and mystical systems are really all about. It's methodology. These are the spiritual requirements before we can accept our spiritual identity.
Well, I do have a curiosity again about the title, because we talk a lot about oneness, of course, But now we're talking about accepting individual spiritual identities. So how does that work with the oneness model?
Well, again, in this model, we understand what individual means. Individual means not divided. And oftentimes we think it means being divided and separate from everybody else. And so it's a little bit different interpretation, because what we're finding is because we accept mortality, we are individuated from the world mind. The world mind is broadcasting and televising its thought, and then it is being accepted as my thought in consciousness. And so this is the hypnotism of the mortal experience. And we call that being an individual, but in truth, we're undivided from this world mind. We're being controlled by this collective consensus. In order for us to graduate, we have to separate from this individuated state of being, joined with the false sense of self, the impermanent human mental material concept of life, and then we have to relink. That's the origins of the word religion, was to relink with the divine creation, the truth of being.
So earlier you had said truth dispels error as light dispels darkness. And we may have some listeners that may not totally comprehend what we mean by the word error. And then hoping you can shed some light on that.
Yeah, this idea of sin, missing the mark. This is the stuff I think Orthodox religion just misses it completely. The error is being individuated from the world mind. This human mental material experience is the entire error. It is the sin. In the Bible, where it says, ye are dead and your life is hid with Christ in God, is a clue. Sow to the flesh is death, but to sow to the spirit is eternal life. These are words in a book until you start to bring them to fruition. You start to experience what it is that they're talking about. And in doing that, you have to unpack everything that's written here and convert it into something you internalize as a genuine experience. Because Jesus says, unless a man be born again of water and the Spirit, he shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. There are requirements here. Like, you don't just assume or declare that I'm spiritual. There's got to be some things in place that we can do in order to activate the genuine God experience that the Bible promises.
So saying those things that we have to do, that would be us realizing the truth, which would dispel the error that you were talking about.
Yeah, that's the simple version. I mean, we have to come out of the belief in matter. In yoga, we say you must divide and conquer before you can unite and stand. This divide and conquer is way more complicated than it sounds. The way Herb Fitch gave us the meaning behind the Sermon on the Mount, these were sequential requirements. The idea of poor in spirit wasn't just, I need to give a little bit more attention to this concept of God that we're talking about. Poor in spirit meant the confession that anything that was wrong in my life had to be attributed to the fact that I was not a faithful witness to the divine truth. Blessed are those that mourn didn't mean that you had sympathy for people that were suffering because of material loss. It was giving up the belief in a personal sense of self that we have to put off the old man. And even the meekness that it talks about as a spiritual requirement. This was a very specific type of humility that comes when one realizes the divine creation is the only life that's here.
Is that what they mean when they say to die daily? We must die daily?
Yeah, the idea of giving up this personal sense of self, that becomes a prerequisite. And then, of course, what is that going to look like when I'm doing it? Because if you don't have this mystic's checklist, you can go over. And that's one of the things that we work with here. We recognize there are obstructions to the divine experience. We must be separated from this false sense of self and at the same time born again in this divine, perfect sense of self. Even though we don't make it happen, we have to come out of the belief we are a finite mortal being. And it's not quite that easy.
Well, I believe we have a soundbite here from Herb Fitch from Realization of Oneness. Would be good to play right now.
Yeah, this is from Realization of Oneness, Class 2B. And if anybody's interested in getting the full audio file or even the entire program, you can get it at mysticalprinciples.com, and I'll play it.
Self of you, the real self, only brings forth the doctrine of the false. But he that seeketh his own glory, there is no righteousness in him. Now here's something very, I think the word is arcane or esoteric. Did not Moses give you the law, and yet none of you keepeth the law? Why go ye about to kill me? They were very angry by this. They really weren't at this moment thinking of killing him. Why did he say that? That was a terrible thing to say. Why do you want to kill me? And so they said, Thou hast a devil. Who goeth about to kill thee? You see, that's exactly what the human mind is doing to Christ all the time in us. We're always slaying Christ. He wasn't talking about Jesus the man. He wasn't talking about them wanting to kill Jesus. He was talking about the mind which slays the Christ within. How? It's always crucifying Christ. It's a constant fact with mortality. Mortality denies the presence of Christ. That's crucifixion. They wanted to kill him. The Christ is saying, why don't you accept me instead of crucifying me? Why don't you admit me into your consciousness instead of shutting me out? Now take Moses. He gave you the law. Well, you talk about the law. You don't even obey the law. Now that's another insult. He's telling these high members of the Sanhedrin that they don't obey the law of Moses. Now you wonder then why it hasn't come to our attention what he meant. Because they certainly believe they obey the law. Who is this upstart saying they don't obey Moses? Maybe they don't know about the inner immortal self, but they certainly know how to obey Moses. But he clarifies that. Jesus answered and said unto them, I have done one work, and ye all marvel. Now the work he's referring to is when he healed on the Sabbath, the cripple. Then he teaches them the law of Moses, which they never understood. Moses therefore gave unto you circumcision, not because it is of Moses, but of the fathers, meaning the covenant was with Abraham and the father. Circumcision. And ye on the Sabbath day circumcise a man. Well, if a man on the Sabbath day receives circumcision, that the law of Moses should not be broken, are ye angry at me because I have made a man every whit whole on the Sabbath day? Judge not after the appearances. Now they didn't understand a word of that, but I think you and I can see what he meant. They were mad at him because he healed a man on the Sabbath day, saying you shouldn't do that. Well, why could they circumcise a man on the Sabbath day? And they said, well, Moses said we can't. And he was saying, haven't you ever heard of spiritual circumcision? Don't you think you have misunderstood what Moses was telling you? Physical circumcision wasn't his teaching at all. But I, who am teaching you the higher teaching, am bringing to you on the Sabbath day the very teaching of Moses carried out and fulfilled as he intended it. You see that cripple who walked? I circumcised him spiritually. How? I broke his tie to the mind of matter. I separated him from the material world. I separated his mind from the world mind. And that is spiritual circumcision. And that is the purpose of all circumcision. And I did it on the Sabbath day because that is what Moses told you to do. To circumcise on the Sabbath day. And that is what was meant by it. Your little physical act means nothing. It is completely impotent. But when you take a man and separate him from the world mind and he walks again, He has been circumcised by the Spirit. He has been cut free from the world of human thought. And every healing in the Bible is the same spiritual circumcision. The individual, whether he's dying or dead or buried, is always cut free from universal belief. And that's why it's done on the Sabbath, because that's the holy day. In fact, it has to be done through the silence, which is the Sabbath. It has to be done in the seventh heaven, the eternal Sabbath. You can only give this kind of healing in the seventh heaven or the eternal Sabbath, meaning the knowledge that God is now resting. His work is done. There's nothing more for the Father to do. 6 days of regeneration for man, and finally the divine self is there. The Father is resting. The work is done. This is the Sabbath of eternity. And on this Sabbath, man is circumcised from world thought. The power and mesmerism of world thought, the hypnosis of it, is broken. He's no longer tied to the mind of matter. He is released into his spiritual identity, and that manifests as a cripple who walks, a blind man who sees, a deaf one who hears. He was fulfilling the law that they could not understand. But who was he? He was your immortal self, the Christ of your being, which fulfills the law. And nothing else can fulfill the law.
We're going to pause right here to hear a word from our sponsor. So listeners, we'll be back with you in just a few moments. Institute for Personal Development Incorporated is a Kriya Yoga ashram offering yoga classes in all 8 stages of Kriya Yoga, including classes, personal training, teacher training, residential program, online live classes, and online products for self-discovery and transformation. Discover, learn, and practice one of the oldest and purest forms of yoga, Kriya Yoga, by uniting ancient religion with modern science. Visit www.ipdtransform.com. Namaste. Welcome back. For those of you just joining us, you're listening to The Voice of Yoga, and we are talking consciousness. So that was a really great soundbite from Herb Fitch. I do have some curiosities, and one of them is about the phrase seventh heaven, and maybe I'm hoping that you could give us some more insight on that.
Yeah, the seventh heaven is equated with the divine creation. The 6 days of creation in the Bible are completed, and on the seventh day, the Creator rests. And so the idea that the divine creation is done, it's whole, it's complete, it's fulfilled, and the Sabbath is the day of rest. And so this day of rest is the realization that the divine creation is complete. There's nothing that ever has to be added to it or taken away from it. And that's why he talks about the silence. The language of spirit is silence. The activity of spirit is stillness. So this invisible, intangible void. Now, in the realization of that comes what's called my peace, the peace that passes understanding. See, the human experience is inundated with anxiety, fear. Fear is a defense mechanism for this false sense of self because it's incomplete. And so the seventh heaven is that state of completion. Divine truth, total consciousness.
So my question now is, we've been talking a lot about time and space and that there is no time. So therefore, we necessarily shouldn't assume that the Sabbath is a Sunday. I would think in this model that the Sabbath would be every day that we should be in silence and stillness.
Right. See, we use mental, material imagery to try and educate the mortal mind up to spiritual apprehension. It's a process we're talking about here, that we graduate from thinking with our 5 material senses. Rational thinking, we're working with a divided consciousness. And then we graduate to spiritual understanding. Spirit speaks in terms of the absolute because spirit is whole, it's complete. And like you say, there's no time, there's no space in spirit. Spirit is invisible and intangible to material sense. But in order for us to be born again of the Spirit, which means separate from being individualized by the world mind, and we do this by rejecting the false mortal sense of self and then accepting spiritual identity, by living in the divine self as the only reality. But in order to do this, we have to come out of these obstructions that are keeping us tethered to the mortal, material, mental concept.
Well, it sounds like it's much easier said than done. So what would your recommendations be? Where do we start?
Yeah, breaking the material moorings is an exact science which requires a checklist. We use the 12 signs of the zodiac, but the 12 interdependent origins of Buddhism or the 12 stones and 12 tribes of Revelations work fine. Even the 12 labors of Hercules. At some point we realize there are spiritual requirements which must be met before access is permitted. Even the term accepting must be unpacked because from the mortal standpoint, it is way too passive. Remember, like attracts like. Before we attract divine truth into consciousness, we must be in spiritual identity, which is the physics of spirituality. Yes, divine truth flows in consciousness and does the work, but make no mistake, divine truth doesn't flow in mortal consciousness or mortal mind. And you can test this by checking your experiences.
Well, let's talk more about the spiritual inheritance and with the spiritual identity. I believe we have another soundbite from Herb Fitch that we could play for our listeners.
Yeah, and if anybody's interested in getting the full audio file, you can get this from mysticalprinciples.com, and I'll play it.
First you send the brethren up to the feast with a letter of truth, and then the Spirit of God, the real inner baptism or circumcision of the Spirit, releases man from the world mind. And you are independent of form, independent of matter. You have broken the form consciousness which has anchored you into sleep in the material sense of life. This was his demonstration to them. This was his meaning. And this becomes that which we accept in consciousness as the presence of Christ in me, here now, as my own immortal life, is the self of me that is permanent. If I live out of an impermanent self, I am always in need of those qualities which can never enter the human self. But there is an impermanent mortal self that I was born into, and there is a permanent immortal self which already has been spiritually circumcised, which is perfect, which is free, which is independent of all form in the world, and I must live from that self in me in order to be unhypnotized by the world of images around me. Judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. You're living in the seventh heaven, the eternal Sabbath of your immortal self. Otherwise, you're going to keep making these progressions through different states of mental consciousness, and everything will always appear finite and limited and lacking to various degrees. But only your immortal sense of self, the reality of you, is the seventh heaven, the permanent Sabbath, the day the Father rests, because the work is done. That's the level we ought to live out of. Not tomorrow. You must be striving every day to live out of that level. Then it overflows into all of the facets of the appearance world. Then said some of them of Jerusalem, Is not this he whom they seek to kill? But lo, he speaketh boldly, and they say nothing unto him. Do the rulers know indeed that this is the very Christ? Howbeit we know this man whence he is, but when Christ cometh, no man knoweth whence he is. Jesus listens to this. How can a man speak so boldly? Who is this, the carpenter's son? We know his father, we know his mother, we know where he came from. How did he get that? Jesus says, No, you do know who I am and where I come from, only partially. Ye both know me. and you know whence I am come. Yes, you know Mary, you know Joseph, that's right. But go a little further, my friend, and I am not come of myself, but he that sent me is true, whom ye know not. What about my divine Father? Do you know him? Do you know my divine parent? Or do you just know my human parent? I'm revealing that I am the child of God, not of Mary and Joseph. I'm revealing my identity to you, the immortal self. Where am I? I was here at this feast before you became aware of me as a person. Where was I? Right where I am at this very moment when you do not recognize me. I am the immortal self of you within yourself that you are not recognized. Recognize me within yourself. Recognize your divine parent. I know you've got human parents just as I have. But who is your real father? And then whose child are you? How can you be the child of the real Father of God and still call yourself a mortal Jew or a mortal Catholic or a mortal Protestant or a mortal Hindu or Muslim? You can't be these things. The child of God has no religion. The child of God is the immortal self. That's what is being revealed here, that they knew him not, just as you and I know not the immortal self of us. We do not know who has sent us.
So Swami, so Herb's saying that Jesus says, recognize me in yourself. Could you just dig a little deeper with that for us?
Yeah, we have to understand that it's not Jesus that is saying this. This is the Christ of Jesus that is saying it. That's why he says all of this scripture that you're reading is really instruction to you to turn within and to realize the Christ within your own being. And I have something here from Mary Baker Eddy. Here is why we may consider doing this. And she says, this is from Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, page 14. And the marginal heading is Spiritualized Consciousness. Become conscious for a single moment that life and intelligence are purely spiritual, neither in nor of matter, and the body will then utter no complaints. If suffering from a belief in sickness, you will find yourself suddenly well. Sorrow is turned into joy when the body is controlled by spiritual life, truth, and love. Hence, the hope of the promise Jesus bestows. He that believeth on me, the works that I do, shall he do also, because I go unto my Father. Because the ego is absent from the body and present with truth and love. End of quote. And when she says ego here, she has it capitalized. See, that's the realization of Mary Baker Eddy, was that there is but one life, and it's perfect.
I have a quick curiosity. What you just read, Jesus says, I go unto my Father. Just wanting to know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, in the Gospel of John, where he talks about your father is a liar, and he talks about that he is sent from the divine Father. He is sent from above, and we are living out from this human sense of self, which is the lie. It's the false sense of self. So he does what his Father asks him to do, which is heal the sick, reform sinner, raises the dead. I mean, these are the deeds of the divine principle. And he also accuses the Pharisees of doing what their father had suggested them to do, but they are branches cut off from the vine, that they live out this imperfect human mortal sense of life.
Well, we're going to close down our show for today, so listeners, be sure to visit the website www.ipdtransform.com. On the homepage, you see the fading banner Blog Talk Radio. Click it, directs you to its catalog page. Click the Products tab, and Online Classes directs you all the classes that Swami has available. With that, Swami, any final thoughts about today's show?
Well, I would like to encourage people to join the Kriya Yoga Spiritual Advance, get the light in your soul, and accept spiritual identity. Namaste.
Thank you for listening to our program, The Voice of Yoga. This is Lisa Winton along with Swami Jayananda signing off. Have a wonderful Kriyoga kind of day. Namaste.